The evening had begun like any other, filled with the ordinary comfort that families often take for granted. The clock struck 7, the sun dipped low, and the sky carried that soft orange glow that promised nothing unusual. Inside the house, laughter echoed from the living room as the family gathered together. The television hummed in the background, teacups clinked against saucers, and the aroma of freshly cooked dinner filled the air. Nothing seemed out of place, and not a single detail suggested that this night would carve itself into memory forever. But sometimes, horror does not announce itself with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, it slips into the quietest corners of life, hiding in the ordinary, waiting to be noticed. It started with a silence that felt heavier than usual. The laughter faded, the clinking of spoons slowed, and for a reason no one could explain, every person in the room felt the sudden need to pause. It wasn't fear yet, but an unshakable awareness, like the sensation of being watched when no one is there. They exchanged brief glances, dismissing the feeling, telling themselves it was nothing. After all, what danger could possibly exist in the comfort of their own home? Yet the atmosphere had shifted. The room, which only minutes ago had been filled with warmth, now felt colder. The shadows cast by the dim lights seemed to stretch further, crawling up the walls as though they were alive. A faint breeze drifted through the house, though no windows were open. The father cleared his throat, trying to brush off the unease, while the children whispered nervously, sensing something that words could not capture. At 7:05, the first sound came, a soft, deliberate creak from the hallway, as though a foot had pressed down on the wooden floorboards. No one had moved. No one was supposed to be there. For a moment, they convinced themselves it was the house settling, just one of those harmless sounds old homes make. But then came the second creak, and this time it was louder, closer. The mother, clutching her cup, tried to laugh it off, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The father stood, walking toward the hallway with forced courage. "It's nothing," he muttered, though even he didn't believe his own words. As he stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder, biting against his skin. He switched on the light, but the bulb flickered violently before dimming into a weak glow. At the far end of the corridor, the shadows pooled unnaturally, darker than they should have been. He stared, waiting for his eyes to adjust, but instead of clarity, he felt the sinking weight of dread. Something was wrong. He returned to the living room, forcing a smile. "Just the wind," he said, but his pale face betrayed his lie. The family tried to return to their routine, but the comfort was gone. Every sound now felt amplified, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint rustle of curtains against the wall. They sat together, too afraid to admit aloud what each one felt in silence. This was not a normal night. The ordinary had shifted into the extraordinary, and though they didn't know it yet, their lives would never return to the same peaceful rhythm again. At first, the signs were so subtle that they could almost be dismissed as tricks of the mind. A misplaced object here, a faint whisper there, things that any ordinary person would blame on forgetfulness or imagination. But night after night, always around the same time, the strangeness grew stronger, demanding attention. The family tried to laugh it off, to rationalize what they were experiencing, but deep down, they all knew something unnatural was happening inside their home. It began with the shadows. In the quiet of the evening, when the lights were dim, they noticed shapes stretching across the walls in ways that did not make sense. A chair's shadow seemed longer than the chair itself, bending at odd angles, almost as if it were reaching toward them. The children were the first to point it out, whispering that they saw figures moving along the hallway when no one was there. At first, the parents dismissed it, assuring them it was just imagination running wild. But one night, the mother herself saw a dark silhouette lingering near the window, unmoving, even when she stepped closer. And when she blinked, it vanished. Then came the whispers, soft, broken murmurs that drifted through the rooms when everything else was silent. The family would stop mid-conversation, certain they had heard someone call their name. It was never loud, never clear, but always chillingly close, like a voice speaking just behind their shoulder. Sometimes, two voices overlapped, one low and guttural, the other sharp and hurried, as though they were arguing with each other. But no matter how quickly they turned or searched, the source was never found. The voices belonged to no one, and yet they filled the house. The coldness followed next. Even with the heater running, certain spots of the house became icy, so much so that you could see your breath fog in the air. The hallway, especially at 7 p.m., was always freezing. The father once wrapped himself in a thick coat and stood there, determined to prove it was nothing. But within minutes, his body shivered uncontrollably, and his skin broke into goosebumps as though invisible hands were brushing against him. He never attempted it again. By now, unease had settled into their daily lives. Dinner conversations became shorter, laughter rarer, and sleep restless. Doors began creaking open on their own. Objects moved mysteriously from one place to another, and sometimes, they awoke to find chairs overturned as though someone had been pacing through the night in anger. The family began to dread 7 p.m., knowing that once the clock struck, the air would change, and the darkness would come alive. What terrified them most was not the sounds, not the shadows, not even the cold. It was the feeling of being watched. At every moment, in every corner of the house, they felt unseen eyes following them. The children stopped playing alone, the mother stopped walking into rooms without turning on all the lights, and the father began locking doors even though he knew locks could not stop what was happening. The first signs of darkness had revealed themselves, and with each passing evening, it was becoming clear, this was no coincidence, no trick of the mind. The house was alive with something that did not belong, and it was only getting stronger. It was on a night colder than usual when this family finally came face to face with what they had been dreading. For weeks, the shadows had taunted them, the whispers had unsettled them, and the strange cold spots had drained them of sleep. But on this night, the horror they felt was no longer just suggestion or imagination. It became a living, undeniable presence. It began, as it always did, at 7 p.m. The family was gathered in the living room, trying their best to ignore the familiar heaviness that settled into the house at that hour. The children huddled close together, while the parents exchanged nervous glances. The mother tried to distract them with a story, but her words felt hollow, her voice unsteady. Then came the sound, a deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway. This was no creak of wood or shifting weight of the house. These were heavy, paced steps, as though someone was walking slowly toward them. The father stood up, his heart hammering in his chest, and called out, "Who's there?" His voice broke the silence, but no answer came. Only the steps continued, each one louder, nearer, until it felt as if the invisible intruder was just beyond the doorway. The air grew frigid, a sharp coldness that cut through their skin and made the children shiver. Suddenly, the living room light flickered violently, throwing the space into a terrifying dance of shadow and dimness. In those flickers, shapes seemed to form along the walls, long arms, twisted faces, and moving silhouettes that did not belong to anyone in the room. And then they heard it, a whisper, so close it seemed to breathe against their ears. First, it was the father's name, slowly, carefully spoken. Then the mother's. Then, one by one, each of the children's names were whispered, repeating over and over again, overlapping like a chorus of unseen mouths. The voices were not human. Some were deep and guttural, others sharp and almost shrill, but all carried the same unnatural tone that chilled their blood. The youngest child screamed, breaking the paralyzing silence, and at that moment, the door to the hallway slammed shut with a force so strong the walls shook. Objects in the room began to rattle. A picture frame fell from the wall and shattered, and the television switched on by itself, blasting static so loud it made them cover their ears. The father rushed at the door, pulling at the handle, but it refused to budge. It felt as though someone on the other side was holding it shut with inhuman strength. The whispers turned into distorted laughter, echoing all around them, filling the room as if the walls themselves were mocking their fear. Finally, after what felt like endless minutes, the chaos stopped. The lights steadied, the television shut off, and the door creaked open on its own. Silence returned, but it was not comforting. It was the silence of being watched, of being toyed with. The family sat frozen, unable to move, their minds grasping for an explanation but finding none. This was no longer a haunting of signs and suggestions. They had encountered something intelligent, something aware of them, something that wanted them to know. They were no longer safe in their own home. The days that followed the encounter were filled with dread. The family no longer tried to convince themselves that it was imagination or coincidence. They knew something was in the house, and it had chosen them. Every evening at 7 p.m., without fail, the air shifted, the shadows stirred, and the sense of being hunted grew heavier. But there came a night when everything escalated beyond whispers and shadows. This was the turning point, the moment that changed their fear into desperation. It began quietly. The family sat together in the living room, clinging to one another as if their closeness could shield them. The father had taken to keeping a Bible and candles near him, while the mother whispered prayers under her breath. The children sat silently, too afraid to speak, their eyes darting toward every corner of the room. At exactly 7:03, the temperature plummeted, and the lights began their dreadful flickering. But this time, the darkness did not linger in the hallways as it stepped into the room. A gust of cold air swept through, extinguishing the candles in an instant. The family was plunged into near darkness, with only the weak glow of the flickering bulb above them. Then, with a sudden crash, every door in the house slammed shut at once. The sound echoed like gunfire, shaking the walls and sending the children screaming. The father shouted, trying to gather courage, but even his voice trembled. "Leave us alone," he cried into the darkness, but the reply was not silence. The laughter was distorted, coming from everywhere at once. It rose and fell like waves, mocking, cruel, and endless. Then, objects began to move. A chair slid across the floor, toppling over. The bookshelf rattled violently before several books flew off and scattered across the room. The television switched on again, but instead of static, it showed only a pitch-black screen. And in the center of that darkness, two glowing eyes stared back at them. The mother clutched her children, sobbing, while the father, in a desperate act, threw the Bible toward the television. The screen cracked, sparks flew, and for a brief moment, the laughter stopped. But the victory was short-lived. A scream erupted, a loud, piercing, and inhuman echoing through the entire house. The walls vibrated as though the building itself was alive, straining under the force of the sound. And then came the final blow. From the ceiling, a dark, shadowy figure began to form, its shape indistinct but its presence undeniable. It stretched downward, tall and menacing, its arms impossibly long, reaching toward the terrified family. The children clung to their mother, the father stood frozen, unable to move. Just as the figure seemed to close in, every light in the house burst, a glass shattering, sparks flying, and the family was left in complete, suffocating darkness. When the lights finally flickered back to life, the figure was gone. But the message was clear: this entity was no longer content with whispers and warnings. It had power, it had control, and it would not stop until it consumed them completely. From that night forward, the family knew escape was no longer simple. They could not ignore it, could not reason with it, and perhaps could not even survive it. The haunting had transformed into something darker, something relentless. This was no longer just a presence in their home. It was a war for their souls. The family had reached their breaking point. Weeks of torment had drained them of hope, leaving only exhaustion and despair. They could no longer sleep without nightmares, no longer eat without trembling, no longer speak without fear of being overheard by the unseen presence that stalked them. Yet the worst was still to come. For every haunting has a root, a reason, and what they discovered would shatter them more deeply than the shadows ever could. Driven by desperation, the father sought help from an old neighbor who had lived in the town for decades. The man hesitated before speaking, his face pale as though recalling something long buried. Finally, he revealed what no one had told them before. The house had a history drenched in tragedy. Years ago, at that very address, a family much like theirs had lived. And just as with them, every night at 7 p.m., terror would unfold. The cries, the screams, the strange disappearances, until one night, the entire family was found lifeless, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open as if they had seen something beyond comprehension. When the father returned and shared the truth, silence filled the room. The mother broke down in tears, the children clung to each other, and for the first time, they realized escape might not be possible. What terrified them most was the pattern, and the curse did not merely haunt, it claimed. And their turn was approaching. That very night, at 7 p.m. sharp, the truth revealed itself. The whispers grew deafening, the shadows spread across every wall, and the laughter returned, louder, crueler than before. This time, however, the voices spoke words instead of names. They told of betrayal, of death, of an unholy pact made within the house generations ago. A man, desperate for power, had sacrificed his own family in a ritual, binding their souls to the property forever. From that moment on, the curse demanded new victims, trapping each family that dared to live there, feeding on their fear, stealing their lives. The family realized with horror that they were not just being haunted, they were being prepared. Every scream, every sleepless night, every drop of fear was nourishment for the thing that lived within the house. The final revelation was not that the house was cursed. It was that the curse required witnesses, participants. A broken bar and now, them. As the clock ticked past 7:30, the figure returned, taller, darker, more powerful than ever before. The children wailed, the mother prayed, and the father stood paralyzed. The lights exploded once again, plunging them into darkness. And in that suffocating black, the voices spoke their last words, words that froze their souls. When the neighbors passed by the next morning, the house looked perfectly normal. Curtains drawn, doors shut, silence within. But those who dared to step closer swore they heard faint laughter, and sometimes, if they listened carefully, the echo of children crying. The family was never seen again. And so the curse lived on, waiting patiently for the next family brave enough or foolish enough to call that house their home.